Back around 1984, the ACJS Executive Board wanted a journal that this organization had more control over. And for many years, ACJS had had an affiliation with the Journal of Criminal Justice. The editor at that time was Kent Jocelyn, and it was a productive one, but it wasn't our own journal. And so the ACJS Executive Board decided to start its own journal, and it wasn't really clear like what it would be called or who the first editor would be. So there was a committee put together, and I think Richard Bennett was on it, and Ed Latessa, maybe Jack Green. They were given the charge of picking the first editor, and they were fortunate to get Rita Simon, who was a major scholar in sociology at the University of Illinois. She had just taken the dean's job at the School of Justice at American University, and she was selected as the first editor of the journal. And I think because she was such an important figure, along with Frida Adler, really establishing the whole study of women in crime in the mid-1970s, that she gave the journal instant credibility with her status as a major scholar and leader in the discipline.
So Edward, could you please tell us a little bit about the birth of Justice Quarterly?
Prior to Justice Quarterly, Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences essentially purchased the Journal of Criminal Justice for its membership. That relationship began to deteriorate. The journal didn't want to compromise and put people on the editorial board, and it really got a little contentious. And so a decision was made by the board to create its own journal. And so Justice Quarterly was of course what came out of all of that. The board decided to create a new journal. In those days, that took a lot of work and a lot of effort. You had to find a publisher. We had to get an editor. We had to put everything in place. But I think history's bore out that it was a good decision, and it's among one of the top journals in the field. And so, but its beginnings were again not easy.
So Justice Quarterly began in 1984. What is your first recollection of this journal, and when did it first come to your attention?
It came to my attention actually when it was formed. I heard about it as the Academy was making the decision to form the journal, and one of my first recollections of it was how smart the Academy was in terms of their selection of the first editor, because I think back then at least I was in the sociology department at the time, and so we were more geared toward publishing in both sociology journals but also more geared toward journals that were more sociological in orientation, like criminology, for example. When Justice Quarterly came, I think there was some suspicion about it, that it wasn't going to be a go-to journal by folks that were in sociology. And then they had Rita James Simon be the first editor. Well, that immediately gave it credibility. We all knew Rita James Simon. We all knew the name, we all knew her work and respected it. So I think that was my first recollection, was just how wise that decision was. I don't know who made the decision, but it was really a great decision. And then they followed it up with Frank Cullen. I mean, you can't get too much better than those two people as editors.
When Rita handed the editorship over to you, what was that experience like, and what made you decide to apply for the editorship?
It was both exhilarating and scary. Exhilarating because this was an opportunity to help shape the field. It was an opportunity to bring to Justice Quarterly, my sense of how we might make this journal the flagship journal of our discipline, and increase its credibility and increase its ability to serve the membership and beyond. And so that was the exhilarating part. The scary part was I didn't want to mess it up. And so following in the footsteps of Rita was big shoes to fill. But I did have a philosophy that served me well, and it's something that I've told other editors that have come after me. That is, when I started out as editor, I thought to myself, what are all the things that editors have done that pissed me off, and don't do them, and that became really, I mean, I'm joking, but I'm not, like actually getting back to people and staying in touch with them about the status of their manuscript. And back then everything was paper and pencil. There was no mail, there was no email, there was no getting in touch with people through the internet. And so running a journal that was sensitive to the interests and needs of authors, that practical aspect of it, that was something else that I hope to bring to the position.
Can you talk a little bit about the selection of the first editor?
That was, I think, controversial. We had a couple candidates for editor. The board was extremely divided. First editor, of course, was Rita Simon, who had not been actively involved in the academy. There was a lot of disagreement on the part of the board. It was a very, very close vote. I think hard feelings that lasted for a long time. Probably some people that whose careers got sidetracked a little bit, at least in terms of their involvement in the academy. But I think it all worked out well. Rita did a good job establishing the journal. Frank Cullen was the second editor and really continued that work. And really elevated JQ in a relatively short time to one of the top impact journals.
So it's been, about 35 years since the journal was first launched. Is it more successful than you ever thought it would be? About as successful? What are your feelings? Are you surprised that it's...
That's a good question. It's a crowded marketplace with journals, right? There's tons and tons of journals. I think the Academy, in some ways, was viewed as less scholarly, less academic in its orientation, especially in those days. And there were probably those that didn't think that it could become, again, one of the top journals. And so I won't say I'm surprised, but I think that certainly if we look at the editors that they've had, they've done a great job of maintaining high standards for the journal. Now people look at it and it's one of the first choices, along with, criminology and some of the other top journals in the field.
So could you tell me some of the challenges and rewards that came with being editor of Justice Quarterly?
Sure. So I was the sole editor of Justice Quarterly for 6 years, from 2010 to 2016. And I think that probably the most difficult aspect of serving as the editor was that I had to evaluate and make decisions on from 200 to 300 manuscripts each year, which is a lot. And I tried to do this in as expeditiously as possible, because I know that authors don't want to wait 6-9 months or longer for a decision, especially given that the modal decision at JQ was a reject, because we could only accept about 10 to 15% of all the manuscripts that we received. So I tried to accept papers within about 60 days. The problem with this is that some of this is really beyond the control of the editor. So you ask individuals to serve as reviewers. They agree to do it within the specified time frame, usually about 3 weeks, and then they don't turn in their reviews, despite weekly reminders. And so after I got comfortable as the editor, in these situations, I would often make a decision based on 2 reviews if both reviewers agreed that the paper should be either accepted or rejected. If there was some disagreement, I would find another reviewer. Another frustrating thing about serving as the editor of the journal is that there were more situations or more cases that I would have predicted in which one person said revise and resubmit and the third person said reject. And in those situations, I often wondered, did these people read the same paper? In those kinds of situations, I would often ask one of the members of the editorial board to sort of play the tiebreaker and look at the 3 reviews and give me an assessment of the paper, especially if it was something outside my own area of expertise. In terms of what's the most rewarding aspect of serving as the journal editor is, I got to read a lot of really interesting work. Not all of those papers made it into the journal, most of them didn't, but I still got to read a lot of really provocative papers. Many of them were way outside my own area of expertise, and I felt like I learned a lot during those 6 years.
You recently became the new co-editor of Justice Quarterly along with Mike Lieber.
Yeah.
What inspired you to take on this awesome responsibility? What enticed you to apply, and what are some of the exciting new directions that you plan to take this journal?
Well, in terms of the first 2 questions, for the last 3 months, I've been asking myself the same. First of all, it was really Mike's idea to do this. He had been the editor, Journal of Crime and Justice, the Midwest organization publication. And he approached me and said, would you like to co-edit Justice Quarterly's proposed to do so. I had thought about editing a journal and had dismissed the idea of doing so. For a number of years I've been asked in the past to apply, and I never have. But it was the one thing that I really haven't done in the profession. You know, I've obviously taught, I've done research, I've been an academic administrator, never been an editor of a journal. Not that I necessarily wanted to be, but when Mike approached me, I thought, well, why not kind of give it a try? So it was because I wanted this kind of experience that I'm having that I decided to go with it. And it also was, in a sense, reassuring that I'd be doing it as a co-editor with Mike, since he had already had experience as an editor and could school me in what to do and how to do it.
So, you know, being an editor, I think it would be a lot of fun, but it is a lot of work. What is it that enticed you to apply for the editorship?
Well, I saw from my previous experience as an editor that there's some reward, basically, in a sense that you could see that you can take a journal and get your hands on it and shape it to a degree. JQ's already pretty well established, so you really don't want to mess it up, but you're hoping you can take it again to that next level. So it was the attractiveness of potentially being a co-editor of a fine journal. And to be honest with you, the other aspects were that it also gave, I felt, some exposure to our university, which is the University of South Florida, so self-plug. And partly was because of the prestige of the journal itself. So we felt that would help with our name recognition in the discipline. But it was really a challenge of taking on a quality journal.
You've had the unique experience of serving as a guest editor of the Journal of Criminal Justice Education. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, so George Higgins was the editor at the time, and he was looking for people to do special issues. So he had one issue on quantitative methods. I believe Travis Pratt edited it, and then he asked me to edit one on qualitative methods. And it was a really nice experience. I thought I would go and look up the citation counts for the articles that appeared in Scopus. And what I found was, of the top 20 most cited articles in criminal justice education, according to Scopus, 5 of them came from that special issue. And the most cited paper in criminal justice education came from that issue. So I'm kind of excited about that.
That is
nice.
very
Yeah.
exciting. What's the article and who was the author?
The author was Sveinung Sandberg from Norway, and it was What Lies Tell Us About Truth. It was kind of this assumption was the people you interview are going to lie, so is this any value in this? And so it kind of talks about how do we make sense of people, even if they're not fully truthful in the interview, how can we still use that as data?
When you were working as the editor, you did some review essays that you published.
Yes, I thought, okay, we're a new journal, and we had a number of very good articles, but a new journal has to start from scratch with no submissions, and Rita had done a great job. But how would we make our journal rival criminology? A lot of what I was thinking about is I wanted Justice Quarterly to be the equivalent of ASC's criminology, to be a journal of the same caliber, same influence. Our field was growing. We had a need for a journal that was a general journal that could serve our membership widely. And so one of the things that I came up with was to have each issue of Justice Quarterly, and I was editor for 3 years, so I had 12 issues. Each issue started with a long review essay. And the reason I did that was, one, to solicit famous people to write the essays to give us credibility. The second reason I did it was I wanted the journal to serve a broader readership, not just people that read empirical articles, but graduate students and people that are making up lectures, to get articles that reviewed whole areas of research. And there are 3 that were, I think, most influential, or ones that I'm the proudest of. One was by Kathleen Daly and Meta Chesney-Lynn, and I asked them to write an article on feminism and criminology. In a way, it scooped criminology in doing that, because ACJS was at times seen as, well, that's for all the practitioners and for people who apply. So doing an article on feminism was sort of ironic. at the time, because it brought our organization, or showed that our organization was open to diverse perspectives. And I had known Kathleen Daly, and she recruited me to Chesney Lynn, and they wrote an article, and it has, it's one of the most cited articles in the history of the journal, has over 1,000 citations. Today, I actually looked up the Google Scholar. And there were 2 other articles written, one by Ray Paternoster and one by Paul Gendreau and Robert Ross. Ray's was on processual deterrence theory, and Bob Ross's was on rehabilitation, the empirical status of these perspectives. They wrote really brilliant essays, and they're also essays that have been cited 800 or so times. And so I think that approach, which didn't last beyond my editorship, but I think for the moment it was something that was helpful, because it gave our journal a set of authors that were very distinguished. It gave us articles that were useful to readers, and it established us as a journal that people could go to for diverse reasons. And so if I had one genius moment as my editorship, it was the creation of those review essays.
And what is it that enticed you to apply to be the editor of JQ?
Oh boy, that's a good question. I had served on the editorial board of JQ for a number of years, and the department chair, the school director at ASU at the time, Scott Decker, said, wouldn't it be great if ASU were to house one of these top journals? And I said, yeah, that would be great. And he said, well, why don't you apply to be the new editor of Justice Quarterly? And I said, I thought about it and talked to some people who served as editor, tried to get a handle on how much time it would take and whether, I could feasibly do it within the constraints of what I was doing at the time, which was, I was the director of the graduate program at ASU. And midway through my tenure as JQ editor, I became director of the school, which those 2 years were very difficult, trying to be a full-time administrator and be the editor of Justice Quarterly. But I had great managing editors. They saved me.
Okay. And so, there have been some awesome editors that have been affiliated with JQ, and it's hard to identify one, in particular, because there's so many. If you had to do it, was there anyone that comes to mind that you thought did an especially good job with the journal, and if so, why?
I actually think I was not as engaged per se with that aspect of it. I think like any journal, editors do affect it to a degree, so they can kind of have a up and down type thing, but I didn't ever perceive JQ as drastically dropping under anyone's leadership. In fact, I thought it was good because they brought in not necessarily the very elite type of academics, but they gave it to other people that could still be active and add something. So like when they had Richard Tewksbury in, came in a lot more of kind of a deviance type of thing, and for me I think that's good. It brings a different bent. Now others may look at some things a little differently. I thought Cassia spawned in when she took over more recently, and then after that Megan Kurlichek, but I think they also raised it even further in terms of the prestige of the journal and maybe the overall quality aspect of it.
The one thing I know is that every editor has worked extremely hard, and whether it's Edna or Rez, for example, who did a great job, and I hesitate to single out any editors because I really think all of them have worked diligently and have upheld the status of the journal, because even today, if you look at Justice Quarterly, you see it is a journal that rivals criminology in its status in the field. It is something which is not just a flagship journal for ACJS, but a journal that is a flagship for the discipline as a whole. And when we look at job candidates at Cincinnati or at other places, if somebody has a criminology or Justice Quarterly article coming out of graduate school, their vita gets pulled out of the pile and they get special attention. I'm not sure that's always a good thing, but it is the kind of journal now that I think the collective work of a series of editors have really made this a journal where it's a journal of destination, and one in which it affects careers, it affects the field, and I think it's a resource which we could not have imagined would have had this impact when we first started the journal back in the mid-1980s.
I'm going to go back a little historical here. I always thought Donna Bishop did a great job. Donna wasn't afraid to take a chance on a manuscript. I remember I sent her a manuscript in her last months as editor, and it was a piece. It turned out to be, I think, still it's probably my most cited manuscript on. It was an observational study of shoplifting, and she recognized that that was going to be a tough sell on a subsequent editor. And so she took a chance on it, did an expedited review on it, and accepted it. And you know, I appreciated her kind of willingness to go out on a limb on that. And then I also thought Finn did a good job. Finn Espenson, you know, he was very author friendly and would take the time to talk you through what needed to be done with a manuscript, and not just kind of pass along the reviews with a you figure it out, you know. Because oftentimes, you know, journals say completely opposite things, and if the editor doesn't take the time to chime in on what direction is the preferred course of action, that really leaves an author in a bad spot. So I thought Finn did a good job of kind of marshaling you through the process.
Well, you know, Justice Quarterly is a relatively young journal. I think it started in the late 1980s, which is not all that young, but relative to some of the other journals in the field. But I think Chet Britt, as editor, I think he did a really good job of enhancing the reputation of the journal. Finn Espenson was editor for 3 years, and he too, I think, elevated the reputation of the journal. So I think it's been under good stewardship for a number of years.
We've had such a long lineage of amazing editors of both of those journals. Of course, I have to say, George Higgins is fantastic. He's done an amazing job for JCJE, and he's helped that grow so much. And those that came before him as well as after are just doing such an amazing job. I'm really excited to see what Marv's going to do with JQ. Marv Crone is just such a respected scholar in the field. I just think the world of him, and I think he's going to do such big things and just continue to improve and hold that reputation high for JQ.
When I got to the board, Cassia Spahn out of Arizona State was coming on as the editor of JQ. Although I personally didn't have a lot of individual interaction with her, I saw the reports, I saw the subscriptions rates increase, I saw the quality of the publications stay really, really high, and she did a phenomenal job, and she stayed on for a good period of time. And the question we were thinking, or the problem was, when it was time for her to step down, who do we get that's going to maintain that level of professionalism? Luckily for us, there was an associate professor out of Albany, Megan Kurlichek, who applied. We unanimously decided that she is the right choice. And the question is, how does transition work when Cassia Spahn does such a fantastic job? How do we have a transition where nothing is left behind? But the relationship between Megan and Cassia was such that it was seamless. And we didn't notice that there was a transition of authorship. And Megan jumped in on day one and did a fantastic job. So we kept the quality. Moreover, the quality increased, over the last 5 or 6 years, from being very, very good to being excellent in JQ. And we're really proud of that.
You're the founding editor of Justice Evaluation Journal. Kind of a little bit about that process, what it's like to be the new editor, and some of your future plans with the journal.
Yeah, so I edited Journal of Quantitative Criminology, and it was did it for 5 years, and I needed a break. And took a break, and then when ACJS was putting together JEJ, Justice Evaluation Journal, I thought about it, and I don't know if I want to do this, but I thought, well, what could I do? And I thought my vision was to try to put together a journal that was just not another journal. We don't need just another journal. What is this journal going to do that these other journals don't? And so I had 2 goals in mind. Goal number 1 was to have both practitioners and academics write in the journal. And so we've been successful in that. Every issue there's a practitioner, at least one practitioner, and academics in the journal. So that was a very important goal. My second goal was to effectively communicate the science without a bunch of Greek equations and letters. And I'm a Greek equation and letter kind of stat guy, but that's not what this journal is about. This journal is about trying to bridge a gap and to do it in a meaningful way between us as academics and what I call the real world. We are now, this is my 2.5 years in. We've just started to fill the 3rd year, 2 issues a year. I don't know if Taylor and Francis wants to do more. It's up to them. I don't make that decision. I don't know if I'll do another term. I think the field needs different sets of eyes and different people driving the airplane. So I think, whether or not I'll apply for a second term, I don't know if they want me to do it. I don't know if I want to do it. And I think it needs to be, diffused throughout the community of scholars. I think there are plenty of other people who could do this as well, if not better than I can, for sure. They might have different ideas and kind of steer the ship in a different direction. So I've enjoyed it so far. I hope people have enjoyed it. And hopefully the legacy of that will be, obviously, the citations, because that means more people are reading it and citing it, but that people actually sit down and go, oh, I really got something out of this. So that's how I ran them. That was my platform. I think being successful in doing that. We've been on time. We haven't been late. So all is good. We haven't had any kind of publishing errors, and so that's always a good thing. When there's no news, that's always good news. I've enjoyed it because it's forced me to think about the field differently than our usual cranking out empirical articles and moving on to the next one. Hopefully the field thinks the same way, and in a year or two there'll be someone else to take it over and they can move on.
How much of a role do you think the editor has in kind of impacting where the journal goes?
Well, I think a lot, personally, within some parameters, as you do have a board that still looks over and the publishing company. A lot of it is, you're trying to balance what you think at the state where Marvin Crone and myself have taken over as co-editors. This is something we've discussed, and our goal is to maintain the standards and if not, raise them. But at the same time, trying to, and getting back to your question, is to be open. I think some of the criticism in the past might have been there's not enough qualitative work coming out of JQ, international, and other topics like that. And so we were cognizant of that, and again, we've only been co-editors for the last several months, but we're open to that criticism and want to address it. So if we get submissions, say for example, that are qualitative, we're trying to make an effort to make sure that some of the reviewers are qualitatively trained. And that's been a criticism, that a qualitative person put their work in and only quantitative people are reviewing it, and their methods, they just see the methods differently. So in that regard, an editor can affect it. I just gave the qualitative as an example, can impact if they're open to that kind of work and working with the right type of reviewers that might give it a chance if it meets a quality kind of standard. Same with international or pieces dealing with gender and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of formation being able to affect a thing. I know when I took over a regional journal, Journal of Crime and Justice, I was the editor for that journal for about 9 years, and we started much different than with JQ, where JQ is really high ranked. That journal was relatively low rank, and I know through the 9 years with the help of the editorial board and reviewers and then people willing to give us their work, we were able to raise that journal's ranking and visibility quite considerably by the kind of policy that editor was trying to take on. JQ shifted that. I think it made it, in my record, somewhat attractive to apply for the editorial position with that prior experience, but I'm trying to retain some of that aspect of openness to discipline. I think also we're trying to make sure too that we're not getting pieces that where a lot of people refer to as salami slicing, that you look at another journal and you kind of see the same authors, not too much of a difference of the piece. We're really trying to do the best we can to make sure we're getting a unique contribution in the journal and to disseminate to the readers of ACJS and nationwide as well.
What do you think is one of the biggest challenges that come with that responsibility?
I've loved having positions as editors. I was editor of American Journal of Criminal Justice for 6 years. And then I most recently became the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Experimental Criminology. So I was really excited about being able to take over another top journal in the field and build kind of my editorial philosophy, so to speak, into that ascension toward that journal. But as far as an editor, I highly value the experience. One, because I get to meet and work with people from all over the world, expand my own network of outreach in that regard. But the main thing too is I get to kind of see behind the curtain, so to speak, what research is out there and keep a pulse on what reviewers are looking for. So I think it's helping me to become a better writer and more productive in terms of my own research when I start to read the reviews myself from other people's research that's submitted to the journal. I can say, reviewers always comment on this, so I'm going to make sure I'm not going to do that when I write my own paper. So it's kind of like a checklist, so to speak, that I've been developing over my time as an editor of things that I should not do or make sure to do in my own research to hopefully increase the probability of it getting ultimately accepted.
What advice would you give to someone that wants to publish an article in JQ?
look at the sorts of articles that appear in recent issues of the journal so that you know the kinds of papers that the journal is focusing on, and read carefully the author's guidelines. Justice Quarterly has, at least when I was the editor, had a strict page limit. I think it was 40 pages including references, and sometimes we would get papers that were 50 to 60 pages long, and they would just get a desk reject because there's no point in sending something like that out for review if the authors are going to have to cut a third of it. If the paper has been reviewed someplace else and you've received reviews, do not disregard the reviewer's comments, because ours is a small field, and if faculty member X is asked to review your paper for Journal Y, they're going to be asked to review your paper for Justice Quarterly, more than likely. I mean, the odds are that you're going to get the same, at least one or more of the same reviewers. And so I think at least paying attention to the reviewer's comments, making the changes that you think are reasonable.
And can you reflect a little bit about what you learned from this experience and provide suggestions as to how future editors of JQ and Journal of Criminal Justice Education can be effective?
So yeah, I was the editor of the Criminal Justice Review and International Criminal Justice Review. Both of those journals are owned in-house at Georgia State. And I was the first fool to do them both at the same time. Predecessors did either one or the other, and at the time, originally CJR was a twice-a-year publication and the ICJR was a once-a-year. And Mike Vaughn, when he was chair, signed a lease with Sage, and one of the stipulations was we get them both up to 4 times a year, and I was the first fool to do them both as 4 times a year. And at the time, I thought that wasn't a big deal because the manuscript volume paled in comparison to what like JE or and certainly JQ does on an annual basis. I mean, I might have processed 100, 120 a year at first, got probably up to over 150 by the time I was done 6 years later. But the volume of manuscripts coming in doesn't necessarily dictate the workload on the back end. And I vastly underestimated how much time went into putting together an issue and then putting together 8 issues a year. Especially when you have low volume manuscripts, you really got to hustle to get quality manuscripts, and then you got to work hard with authors to get those manuscripts into shape. Journals like JQ have the luxury of rejecting all but the top 5%. And when you're in a mid-tier journal, you got to work to transform the stuff that JQ rejected into something that's publishable. So that's quite a bit of work. So I think my advice to future editors, I mean, with JQ, I think that the key, and any journal for that matter, is figuring out how you're going to use your ed board. You know, some editors use ed boards. I used them as reviewers, and I told them coming in to put an ed board member on every manuscript. So you're going to, review 6, 8 a year, prepared for that. But I always use my associate editors as kind of my, not hatchet men, but the folks at the end where if I couldn't make a decision or if I was kind of torn between a direction, I used Scott Decker for a lot of years for that, and Scott, is widely read across all sorts of subject matter, and he had the ability to kind of say, yeah, I would go the other way, or I would do this, or, I think figuring out how you're going to use your ed board. Are you going to use them as a reviewer? I know Rick Tewksbury used his ed board as finding manuscript reviewers, so he would send out a topic and say, hey, I got a paper on police culture. Who are some names that you would recommend that do good work in that area? So. And you got to take care of your ed board and your reviewers. You got to conserve their time. And then also on the back end, if you don't think the work is good and you think that the reviewers mailed in the reviews and didn't do a good job, you got to be willing to reject it and take the consequences of people saying, well, I got 3 positive reviews and a reject. It was not infrequent that people would call the dean, because the dean was our publisher, and complain about a decision, or call Sage and complain to editorial supervisor, and you just got to be willing to say, here's why I did what I did, and I get it, it's not a popularity contest.
Alex, can you tell me a little bit about your style of mentoring graduate students and whether or not either Justice Quarterly or Journal of Criminal Justice Education has helped you in the mentoring?
Absolutely. So when I work with my doctoral students, and even undergraduate students, but primarily doctoral students, I treat them as my colleague. So all of my students call me Alex. I do not respond to Dr. Piquero. I do not respond to Professor Piquero. And I bring them into my office and we sit down and we say, okay, this is the research question. I said, you're an author just like I'm an author. And so if you disagree with something I want to do, then fine, disagree with it and tell us why we should do something differently. Mm-hmm. So it's a complete team effort. And I tell them all the time, You have to keep your eye on the prize. And the prize is putting together the best possible research product and publishing it in the best possible outlet that we can. And that's the goal of mentoring. So it's a very interactive relationship. It's a very egalitarian relationship. We are a team when we work together, and that's my approach to working with students. When I was a graduate student, I was tasked with reading all the top journals. And in ACJS, obviously, JQ and JCJE are those journals. And I have my students, every issue comes out, I want you to read every abstract. Your job as a student is to go to the mountain and read and read and read and read and read and learn. They probably don't like that when they are a graduate student, but when they leave and then they get a job and then they come back at a conference, their first academic job, they start in August and they see me in November. You were so right, we're so busy, but I learned so much. And so that's when you know you did the right thing. So those journals are instrumental because JQ publishes top quality research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, it doesn't matter to me, it's the best possible research. And JCJA is the other part of our job, which is just as important, and that's about teaching and mentoring students. I don't think that you should focus on one research or being a great teacher. I try to be the best in both, and I think that people who are really good in both are special, and I think that you can do that if you want to put the time and energy into that. So those journals have been instrumental to my professional development, and I use them consistently when mentoring my students.
But is there an article, in your opinion, that you particularly appreciate? And if so, what is it about this particular article that you respect?
Well, that's a hard question. My interest is mainly in the theories of crime and the investigation of those. So Justice Quarterly published an article senior authored by Pratt on social learning theory, which of course is near and dear to my heart, and was a meta-analysis, and that I use in my classes, and that's been an important piece. The other article that I use a lot in terms of my research and to some extent inspired some of the things that we've done is it was done by Restivo, 2015, I believe, and it's on labeling theory, and it's a very good article on labeling theory, and it hasn't gotten any awards, and it hasn't been all that well recognized, but it should be.
Oh, that's a tough one. I cite from there all the time, JQ articles, primarily since I teach doc students, mostly with journal articles anyway, so I'm citing from JQ all the time. I would be hard-pressed to choose one because the rationale for selecting different articles for different reasons comes up over and over. Sometimes it's because it's a seminal work in a particular topical area and it's cited a lot. Other times I'm using JQ pieces because of the methodology that's employed and because those are excellent examples of quality empirical work.
An article from JQ I use in my graduate research methods class a lot. It's an article that tested specific and general deterrence through a gun seizure program in Indianapolis, and it was conducted by Ed McGarrell and his friends and colleagues. It's a fantastic methodological design. They were able to test different mechanisms of deterrence, and it's just a very well-written, complicated article, and it illustrates so many things to graduate students that I use that article every semester that I teach that class.
So Erin, can you talk a little bit about the success of one of your graduate students who recently got an article accepted in JQ?
Absolutely. Her name's Catherine Meeker. She's a second-year doctoral student at Sam Houston State University. And as a result of her thesis work when she was a master's student, which looked at arrest and charging decisions in sexual assault cases that involved adolescent complainants, she submitted that work to Justice Quarterly in May of this year, and we got final word of acceptance this month. So it was a really quick process. And so her work contributes to the body of literature because a lot of case processing research looks at sexual assault that involves adult complainants or doesn't necessarily tease apart the differences between adolescent and adult experiences with the criminal justice system. So what I really admired about Catherine's work was she looked at age-specific factors that could influence the police decision to arrest or the prosecutor's decision to file initial charges. So she looked at things like the suspect and victim age, so whether a victim who was an adolescent was victimized by an adult versus another adolescent, whether that influenced criminal justice case processing. She looked at who reported the incident. So in terms of adolescents, whether it was a parent or a caregiver as opposed to the complainant, him or herself. And so just looking at kind of those age-specific factors, I think made a good contribution to the existing body of literature on case processing.
Can you talk a little bit about one of your favorite articles that made it in JQ, and what is it about this particular article that you're most proud of?
There are two, and they're recent articles actually, that I'm most proud of. Myself and my students for the last, maybe 15 years or so, have been exploring issues regarding labeling theory. There are two that have been published. One senior author is a former student of mine, Schmidt, and the other one, B.E.D. Dong. And those two focus on issues regarding labeling. And the reason why they're my favorite articles that have been published in Justice Quarterly, I think, is because, for two reasons. I think one, they are, I'm mainly a theoretical criminologist or life course criminologist, and I haven't dealt that much with the criminal justice system. Well, labeling theory requires you to deal with the system, but it's also has behavioral implications. And so those two articles are ones that I think if I had my career to do over, I'd publish more in those kinds of issues. And two, I think they represent what I see as what Justice Quarterly should represent as a dissemination tool.
What it felt like to win this prestigious award.
So it was really an honor to have won this Outstanding Article Award. And the paper, was a really great collaboration when I was a graduate student with two faculty members, Nancy Rodriguez and Kevin Wright. And the analyses for that paper I did, and they started off in a stats class that I took. And then we kind of used them and partnered with Nancy and Kevin to kind of develop and put the paper together. So Nancy Rodriguez was so generous. These were her juvenile data on system-involved youth. And so what we were really interested in was, whether different ethnic and forms of racial and ethnic inequality differentially impacted the likelihood of reoffending for Black, white, and Latino youth in Arizona. And so that was a really cool and exciting study. We found that ethnic inequality had actually different effects on recidivism than racial inequality. And it really kind of spoke to various dynamics about the Latino paradox and the unique experiences of Latinos living within the Southwest. But yeah, it was exciting to win that award, and it was an honor. That paper, JQ was not the first place that we sent it, but it went through, and it also went through multiple rounds of revisions at JQ, and really the paper improved tremendously throughout that review process, and so it was an honor to receive the award because it was a lot of work.
The creation of the Journal of Criminal Justice Education was very little controversy. We felt at the time that the field was maturing, that we needed a journal that helped the membership in the field learn more about pedagogy, learn more about how we conveyed ideas in the classroom, more about what worked in teaching and criminal justice education. And so it really was an easy decision to make. And again, I think that journal has filled a big niche there in the field. Again, very proud of it and all it's accomplished. And every once in a while, you'll see a great piece about what somebody's doing in the classroom or about how students feel about certain topics. So I think that journal has lived up to our expectations.
So Mitch, talk to me a little bit about the article that you published in Journal of Criminal Justice Education.
Well, one of the first articles I published in my career was an article over 20 years ago about using history to teach classes on drugs and drug abuse and that sort of thing. As a historian and a criminologist, probably one of the few major journals, criminal justice and criminology, that accepts historically oriented qualitative research. And so I really enjoyed that, and I was very thankful that it still exists because it's a journal that I actually read the articles.
You publish quite a bit on scholarly productivity and criminal justice. You do a lot of work on that. How did you become interested in this topic? And of all the different articles you've looked at with scholarly productivity, which is one that you're particularly proud of?
So my research on publication productivity, that's primarily, if not solely, been published in Journal of Criminal Justice Education historically, was basically, it emerged organically through conversations at conferences or just from my friends. Like, we're talking about, like, I wonder if this journal is always going to be a good journal, or what happened to this journal, why it was good and then now it's not, or people used to send stuff here and now they don't. Or so it's the idea is that all these conversations we have, it's like we have PhDs, right? We're scientists. It's an empirical question, so let's analyze it, right? Probably of my articles on research productivity, publication productivity, probably the most exciting one for me, and it was actually one of the first ones that I did on the publication trajectories of scholars, because I was able to apply my methodological orientation and skill set trajectory models to a empirical question about how many trajectories are there for academics. And so it was really cool to see how there are different groups of academics that publish at different rates as far as annual productivity, but it also knocked away some of the anxiety that people probably likely have with the expectation of publisher perish. People are publishing 10 articles a year. What's going on? I can only get one. I can only get two. We're able to demonstrate that more frequently, people are averaging around one article a year. And then in top journals, maybe averaging a quality publication every other year. So we kind of busted the myth of the two a year, at least in our discipline historically. Now there's going to be some generational changes, and I'm actually thinking about, it's been a decade since that paper come out. I think now would be an interesting time to do a replication of it with a newer cohorts of scholars and see if now we're closer to that averaging 2 articles a year award, and or has the quality expectations increased or stayed the same.
Do you have any personal anecdotes about an experience involving either JQ or Journal of Criminal Justice Education that you'd like to share?
Sure, I have two. The first article that Peter and I, the only article Peter and I published in JQ, we were in the midst of the review process when I got activated for 9/11. And so I was sent to an island called Diego Garcia, which is 1,000 miles off the southern tip of India, for 5 months. And that left Pete to do all the work, basically going through the revision process, doing the revise and resubmit, and getting the article accepted. And so that was really the only article we ever wrote together where he did the lion's share of the work. The second article that I was a part of in JQ also has an interesting story behind it, because I was at Eastern Kentucky University and I saw that Pam Wilcox got hired at the University of Kentucky. And so I picked up the phone one day and I called Pam, because we'd met at either ACJS or ASC and had known each other for years. I said, Pam, it's silly that we live 30 minutes away from each other and don't co-author together. So why don't I come up there to your office and we talk about publication opportunities? And that phone call resulted in the article that we did with Stacy Roberts around school safety issues there in JQ.
One of the things that I remember and I think about when I think of Justice Quarterly and also Journal of Criminal Justice Education is Dr. Rolando Del Carmen, who recently passed away, a longtime professor for several decades at Sam Houston State University. Whenever a faculty member or a graduate student published an article in JQ or Criminal Justice Education, he would take a group to lunch to celebrate that achievement. And I got to go on a few of those lunches with him and graduate students and other faculty members. And it was just a really nice celebration, because he was so happy for the people that published articles there, and he was so happy to celebrate that achievement. And it really was an important achievement to him. He took great pride when one of his students and colleagues published there. So he held those two journals in such high regard, and he liked celebrating when people publish there. So that's the memory that comes to mind when I think about those two journals.
My memory of Justice Quarterly involves an article that I did for the Journal about the arrest of black suspects by white police officers. I argued that wherever possible it shouldn't happen. And I gave a talk to police officers based on that article, and guess what? They didn't like what I had to say, but they haven't arrested me yet, so it's okay.
The one thing that I thought was really important as an editor, which I've alluded to, is treating authors correctly. I tell my graduate students the review process is brutal. You have you do everything right, and you can still get rejected. It's a daunting process to go through. You invest so much, and I always had a sense of empathy for people who got rejected. Now I joke sometimes when I'd say that when I get to accept an article, I would always say, I am delighted to accept your article. And when I had to reject an article, I would say the reviewers unfortunately didn't accept your article, right? So I did try to take as much credit as I could. But I think the biggest thing that I always tried to do was to put myself in the role of a person who had been rejected, because I had been many, many times in my career, and to do something right back to them in a way that was constructive, affirming, providing opportunities of where they might go next with the manuscript. And the one story that sticks in my mind is I was at a conference, and I walked by Charles Lindquist, who was at University of Alabama, Birmingham, and he stopped me, and I had just recently rejected his article, and I was thinking, oh no, this is awkward. And so I got up, and he said, no, Frank, I got to talk to you. And I said, what is it? He said, you write the nicest rejection letters I've ever seen. And I took that as a distinct compliment, that even for people that I might have rejected, that I could still bring a measure of humanity to that process.
One thing that surprised me about serving as the editor of Justice Quarterly, and as I said, I probably made decisions on 1,200 to 1,500 papers. Most of those decisions, unfortunately, the paper was rejected, either after an initial review or after an opportunity to revise and resubmit. And what surprised me was how few complaints I received from people whose papers were rejected. I expected that people would sort of reach out to me and question decisions that I'd made. And there were really only 3 papers where the authors were very upset, and only one situation where the author actually demanded, and demand is the only term I can use in the situation, demanded that I send the paper out for re-review. And just to keep the peace and appease this one particular person, I agreed to do so. But I think most reviewers were actually pleased with the quality of the reviews that they got, and that they received constructive criticism that enabled them to revise their papers and send them out to a different journal, and I certainly hope that they were successful in finding a home for their papers. But that did surprise me, that so few people objected to the decisions that the reviewers and I made on their papers.
Again, with the article in JCJE about offender reentry, it was really inspirational to me to hear back from people that not only were interested with what I did, but were giving me their own ideas of good things to try and to bounce off. And so it's impressed me, I think, and it just really kind of shows how one small piece, something that you may think may not be that significant, can kind of light that fire to inspire other people to do things, but also to help you improve your own teaching and your own scholarship. And so just the one thing kind of branches out into one, a whole big tree of contributions in the field. So
you do a lot of research on campus safety. Can you reflect back a little bit on your days as a graduate student here at Vanderbilt? And when did you first become aware of Justice Quarterly, and how did you first learn about the importance of this journal in the discipline of criminal justice?
Yeah, I actually remember very clearly. So Denise Gottfredson was a consultant on a grant I was working on related to school security, and she was very kind to me as a mentor and would respond to emails asking for advice about probably pretty silly things. But she passed along one of her papers that was published in Justice Quarterly, and I wasn't trained in a discipline related to criminology or criminal justice, and so it was a journal I had not heard of, but the paper was great, and so that sort of stuck in my head, this Justice Quarterly journal. And then as time went on and I started learning more about this field, I sort of began to understand its reputation and stature in the field, and yeah, it publishes great research.
We were chatting about before we started rolling the camera.
Oh yeah, of course. I don't want to ruin the surprise for my presidential address, but one of the items I'm addressing is that in terms of us making a broader real-world impact, we might be producing too much research. I'm certainly not saying JQ is producing too much research. We live in a setting where there's a great deal of predatory journals, or we may call them pseudo-journals, pay-to-play journals, where authors are submitting work, they're undergoing this minor, low-scrutiny peer review process, getting accepted. Sometimes they pay to see their works published. And we as academics know those works aren't of the same level of repute. They didn't undergo the same tedious process. Those findings may be questionable. But when we expect a broader field, criminal justice practitioners, policymakers, and anyone from the public to look at our research, they don't know the difference between the high quality work in JQ and an open access journal. We lose our meaningful research in places like the American Journal of Criminal Justice and JQ because there's so much out there. And Google results may send someone to a predatory journal as opposed to the quality journals like JQ and AJCJ.
So you mentioned the journal's called Justice Quarterly, yet it comes out 6 times a year. What's up with that?
I asked somebody who was the board of ACJS at the time. He was regional trustee, Brad Smith, and he just joked and he's like, no one will notice if we call it JQ. And I said, yeah, but you're confusing people like me and my students because quarterly means 4 times a year, not 6 or 8. And he said, because we have a name recognition of JQ, we don't want to change it. And so they're moving away from calling, he said, and everyone I've talked to since then, of calling it just quarterly, and now it's just JQ. And so as long as no one asks what the J and Q stands for, I guess it's okay.